Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Great to have you with us. Today we're diving into something really special, I think, deep into the heart of some profound wisdom. We're focusing on Rumi's incredible work, the Masnavi, Book 1. You've shared some amazing bits from it, and, well, our mission is what it always is. Pull out those key nuggets of knowledge, those spiritual lessons, and the meanings that still hit home today. Rumi, well, he has this amazing way of blending poetry, metaphor, and really deep spiritual insight. So this isn't just about old texts. It's about finding those little surprises, those aha moments that connect that ancient wisdom to, well, to your life right now.
Absolutely. And Rumi's Masnavi, it really becomes this journey into the self, doesn't it? And maybe even more into our connection with the divine. Rumi, as a Sufi master, he uses these complex allegories to guide us. And he starts, interestingly, with this idea that the Sufis, these spiritual seekers, are like mirrors of the soul. That's kind of our starting point.
That mirror of the soul idea,
Yeah.
it really jumps out, doesn't it? Right at the beginning, he talks about Sufis sitting straight in front because their whole role is serving as the mirror of the soul. Makes you stop and think, right, what does that actually mean to be a mirror like that? How do you get there?
Yeah, that's the key question. And Rumi says it's through, well, a pretty intense process of purification. They've had to cleanse their hearts through mystic meditation. That's the phrase he uses. And doing that allows these pure forms to fill their mirror heart's reflection. Think of it like polishing a mirror until it's perfectly clear. Total clarity, total receptivity.
And it seems like not just anyone wants this mirror. He mentions people with righteous natures and beautiful faces specifically wanting it because it shows their hearts have goodness, scrapes them clear. So the mirror isn't just passive reflection.
Exactly. It's active. It's a tool for purification, for really revealing and polishing that inner goodness.
Okay, so building on that idea, Rumi then takes us into this story, the story of Joseph. Very famous, of course. He brings in Joseph's childhood friend, who asks him about, all the hard stuff he went through, the jealousy from his brothers, everything.
And Joseph's answer, it's incredible. Such resilience, such acceptance of, well, God's plan. He says, the lion's not ashamed, bound in a chain. About the Lord's decree, I don't complain.
Wow.
Yeah. And then he adds, though the lion's neck with chains is bound, he rules all chain makers that can be found. It's this powerful idea about inner strength, trusting something bigger, even when things look impossible.
That image is so strong. The lion, chained, but still ruling. Yeah. And that sets up the friend asking about the time in jail and in the well. Joseph's answer is another metaphor, isn't it? Just like the moon when in its waning phase.
Right. And this moon metaphor, it's so rich if you unpack it. Joseph explains, though when it wanes, it's seen to shrink and bend. Still, it becomes a full moon in the end.
Ah, okay. So it's about growth through hardship.
Precisely. Even when things look like they're declining, like suffering, the moon shrinking, our own trials, there's this promise of returning to fullness. It's cyclical, not just a straight line down. Those dark phases are often setting up something brighter.
That makes a lot of sense. And Rumi keeps going with this idea, right, with other examples. He talks about pearls being ground down to grant sight to the eye inside the soul. I mean, think about that. Something precious, crushed for a higher purpose, an inner sight.
Exactly. And the same thing with seeds. Planted, grown to wheat, then ground to bread.
Right.
And then the bread is eaten and gives life, wisdom, and intelligence. It's the same pattern. That initial breaking down, that reduction, the waning moon, the ground pearl, the milled wheat, it's not actually waste. It's a necessary step, an effacement, as Rumi calls it, for something higher to emerge, like the effacement of life and love. It's not destruction, it's fulfillment, because something much bigger comes out of it.
Okay, so then there's this interesting turn. Joseph suddenly asks his friend for a gift. And this feels like Rumi shifting gears, maybe talking about our own readiness for what he calls Resurrection Day.
Yeah, it's a definite pivot. And the analogy Joseph uses is pretty blunt. Going empty-handed to a friend's worse still than setting off without wheat to the mill.
Oof, okay.
And he connects it directly to that divine gathering, Resurrection Day, where God asks, so where's your gift? It's meant to make you stop and think, what have I actually done with this life I was given?
Yeah, that question feels urgent. Are you alone without a present too, in the same shape as I created you? Oh, it's quite a challenge. But I wonder, does this sound a bit transactional? Like God is just checking our homework. How does Rumi square that with grace?
That's a really good point. It's not about earning salvation through gifts. It's more that for Rumi, true belief naturally leads to certain actions, certain inner states. His warning about those who disbelieve this day, It's quite strong. The implication is going empty-handed isn't just bad manners, spiritually speaking. It suggests you didn't really believe in that day of accountability.
Ah, I see. So the emptiness itself shows a lack of faith.
Kind of, yeah. It suggests you weren't preparing because you didn't truly expect to be asked. That lack of belief is the real empty-handedness.
So what is the recommended gift then? Rumi gets specific. He mentions things like sleep less, reduce to the amount you eat, take then a present when you're due to meet. Pretty ascetic stuff. And also, at dawn seek his forgiveness, truly weep. That's about genuine feeling, repentance.
Right. And the purpose behind these practices, Rumi explains it using another metaphor. Spiritual growth is like a fetus moving towards a much wider space. And that wider space, he says, it's God's land is vast, the lofty realm of prophets. A place where hearts are free, where you won't see shrivel up a fresh young tree. It's about spiritual vitality, being reborn into something boundless.
He even links it back to sleep, which is fascinating. Sleep as a little taste of how saints are born when they're effaced. He mentions the companions of the cave moved by God while they're completely unaware.
Oh.
It makes you think about unconscious growth, right? That deep change can happen without us consciously driving it.
Well, Rumi interprets even that unconscious movement. Moving to the right side means proper and good action, and the left side, that's the body's own source of distraction. So the idea is that real spiritual progress can happen without you consciously trying if you're aligned with that divine guidance, even when you're just resting, supposedly.
Okay, so let's get back to Joseph's friend and his gift problem. He's feeling ashamed, right? Because what can you possibly bring someone like Joseph? He asks, how could I bring a nugget to the mine, a single drop to a vast sea of wine?
Exactly, or like taking cumin to Kerman, bringing coals to Newcastle, essentially. It feels pointless. And this is where the real humility kicks in. The friend realizes no thing is worthy of Joseph's perfect form. So what does he bring? A mirror.
A mirror. Okay.
And his reason is beautiful. He says, bring it so you can see in it the face I love. And I've brought a mirror so that when you see your handsome face, you'll then remember me. It's setting up this deeper, almost paradoxical meaning of the mirror. It's for self-reflection, yes, but reflecting inherent perfection.
And this leads to maybe the most mind-bending idea Rumi gives us here. Non-being serves as being's mirror, friend. So choose non-being if you comprehend.
That just goes against everything, doesn't it? We strive for being, for having things, making our mark. He says, choose non-being. Why? What does that even mean?
It is counterintuitive, but look how Rumi illustrates it. He gets all these examples. He says, being like God's presence or goodness is clear in the poor when men give generously. The poverty highlights the generosity.
Hunger is the mirror that shows the value of food. Emptiness, like raw wood, is what allows the carpenter's skill, their being, as a craftsman to shine.
Right, you need the blank slate.
Exactly. A doctor's skill, their being as a healer, is only visible because of injury or sickness, the non-being of health. Alchemy's power is shown by the flaws in copper it aims to transmute. So the core ideas, absence, imperfection, lack, this non-being. It's precisely what allows presence, perfection, being to be seen most clearly.
Wow, okay. All things thus make their opposites appear. So our flaws, our defects, they aren't just negatives.
They're potentially mirrors. Mirrors through which perfection, maybe even divine perfection, can be reflected or understood. It completely reframes how you might look at your own shortcomings.
Which leads right into personal growth, doesn't it? Rumi says, whoever recognizes his own faults towards perfection rapidly then vaults.
Yes. Are we actually willing to look at our faults, not just with shame, but maybe as the starting point for that vault towards perfection?
But there's a big warning sign too.
The huge one.
But if you think you're perfect as you are, you won't reach God, for you have strayed too far. He calls imagining you're perfect is the worst of faults. He even links it to Satan's mistake, I'm better.
Yeah, that self-conceit, thinking you've got it all figured out, that you're flawless, that's the biggest roadblock. And he uses this really graphic metaphor for hidden flaws, the dung beneath the surface of a stream.
Yeah.
The water looks clear, but stir it up, and it turns browned. He says our own stream often looks pure and clean to us, but that dung in your stream's bed is unseen until it's disturbed.
It's a potent image for self-deception about our own purity.
Definitely.
Which leads to his final point in this section, really. The need for help, for a knowing guide to join streams to the universal soul. Because, as he says, the streams can't clean themselves. We can't do this purification alone.
Precisely. Man needs God's knowledge, needs help. Just like a sword can't carve its own handle, or you need a surgeon for a wound. We need that external, maybe divine, maybe just wise guidance for our inner wounds or muddiness. And he adds one more thing. Those flies are fancies and possessions. All the distractions, the ego attachments, they buzz around and keep us from seeing our own putrid foulness, our own need for cleaning. They keep us looking outward, not inward.
What a journey. Seriously, what an incredible path Rumi takes us on just in this section of the Masnavi. From that starting image, the Sufi as a mirror, through Joseph's trials, seeing hardship as transformation.
Yeah, the waning moon becoming full.
Exactly. And then this profound, really challenging idea that our imperfections, our non-being, can actually be the mirror reflecting perfection.
It really ties together beautifully, doesn't it? The key things to take away, I think, are accepting hardships as part of the growth cycle. The idea of preparing spiritual gifts, which is really about inner work and sincerity. And crucially, learning to see our flaws not as dead ends, but as starting points, as mirrors even. The best gift we can bring might just be that authentic, humble self, aware of its flaws, but ready to be polished.
So for you listening, maybe something to chew on as you go about your day. How could looking at your own perceived flaws, your defects, actually open up something deeper? Maybe show you a potential you didn't see or connect you to something bigger. And what might it mean for you to choose non-being in some small way, to let go of striving for perfect being just for a moment and see what gets reflected back? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. It was quite something. We hope it gave you some food for thought. Until next time, keep exploring that rich tapestry of knowledge with us.